The Bettany Estate, Murat County, Taldor, second week of summer, 4718. It was the second morning waking up in the Bettany Estate for Martella's conspirators, the newly appointed Baron Aurelius, a Katheeran-trained Mage of the Vale, Marius, the Half-Orc Brawler, Diyanah, a dragon-style monk and youngest son of a prominent Taldan noble family, Rankle, the Cavern elf oracle with mercurial fey powers, and Demi the bard, who as an android from Numeria had origins that were only clearly understood by Aurelius, the most learned of their company. All of them, apart from Demi, were nursing a terrible hangover this morning, as on their first day they had treated the town to an impromptu celebration, after announcing their arrival and intentions to the town. Their longer-term plan was ambitious. They had 8 to 10 weeks, the better part of the summer, to galvanize opposition to Murat County's ruling count, Bartleby Lothede, the half-brother of their sponsor, Martella. To assist in their plotting, they had laid out a map of Murat County, and Demi annotated as the others struggled to recover from the pounding headache and lack of sleep. Helping them in their recovery, though, were the estate's domovoi, small and slightly adorable cat-like fey creatures that had evidently been in the service of Alice Bettany before she had passed. They seemed to have seamlessly adjusted to the presence of Aurelius and his companions, and in fact were making coffee and buttered toast to help bring the party back to life. "Here," said Demi, "rough travel times as I can make them, by horseback between the estates, 4 hours to the Okerra estate, 6 hours to the Palace of Birdsong, 10 hours to the Voinum estate. It's a 2-day ride to Moost, Jambus, and Newtown, but if we repair the Gold Canyon Bridge here, we can get those travel times down to between 1 and 1.5 days, depending. Each time we visit with one of the barons, we'll be expected to spend a night there, so realistically, with managing affairs here in Stakis and getting it back up and running, we can probably afford to stop in on 2 barons each week." "Yeah, makes sense," said Aurelius. "And I think we should probably prioritize Voinum and Okerra, only because they both offered some investment at the party, and we need that sooner rather than later to win over the townsfolk." "Okay, I know we've only just arrived, but I'll send Rodrigo ahead with a message announcing a planned visit to Okerra tomorrow, and a planned visit to Voinum in, say, 3 days. That'll give us a day to finalize arrangements on the house repairs and on market construction and on the pump house. Also, I'll need the better part of a day anyway to study the arcane enchantments that once powered the pump house wheel. We'll be back in town for the last few days of the week to check in on progress then." "Sounds like a perfect plan for week 1, said Demi. "Week 2? "I think we should try to win over the Crabbies in week 2. As much as I'd love to find out more about Baron Tellus, we can fund the reconstruction of the bridge in week 2, and that'll make it less time wasted when we eventually check in on him on, say, week 3. Still plenty of time before we start hitting Martella's time limit, right?" "Problem," said Diyanah. "I may have offended Baroness Crabby. If you're planning a trip to Moost, you might want to make it without me." "These barons have large entourages," said Rankle. "It would make sense for Aurelius to have another servant. You have a hat of disguise, right? Even without my natural skills for deception, you can just present yourself in disguise like I do. No one will notice a thing, I'm fairly certain." "Oh," said Diyanah, "great idea. I'll come up with a suitable character." Aurelius worried slightly at Diyanah's excitement regarding this prospect, but that was a problem for future Aurelius to deal with. "I think we should also check in on Count Lothede," suggested Demi. "Why?" said Diyanah. "I mean, our goal isn't to influence him so much as to get rid of him, right?" "Yes, but as long as he thinks of us as relatively friendly, he's less likely to think we're plotting against him," said Demi. "If we visit every single other baron before checking in on him, he'll find that suspicious. Not to mention he did offer to show Aurelius his arcane lab." "I'm fine with that," said Aurelius, "but we'll have to find a reason not to spend a night at the palace. After Diyanah's nightmare, I can't help but feel we should be avoiding that." "He'll be insulted by that," warned Demi. "So let him be insulted," said Aurelius. "We have to play this safer than we have been, and that means being cautious around threats we don't fully understand." "I have a proposal," said Marius. "Demi and I proceed ahead and spend a night at the estate. Demi doesn't sleep, and I felt undisturbed. The rest of you can grab an inn in town. We'll come up with a suitable cover story, like a broken wagon wheel or something. That way we look like we're spending a night with Count Lothede, but most of us are resting safely in Lothidar." "Yeah, that works," said Aurelius. "We should all be prepared to disguise ourselves, though, if we're spending a night in Lothidar. That's his turf, and it wouldn't do to be caught out there in a lie." "Okay, we can figure out those details later. What about week 3? said Demi. "Hopefully by then the bridge is fixed," said Aurelius. "And we can finally find out what's going on with the reclusive 6th Baron." "We should stop by Newtown as well in that case," suggested Marius. "I have no strong desire to spend any additional time with Lord Titus than I need to," said Aurelius. "He's also not a baron, he's a tribune, and he holds no real power. Why should we stop there?" "His fiancée, Lucrezia, invited me," said Marius. "I think she could prove a useful ally." It was hopefully plain to everyone that she and Titus are no happy alliance. There's an angle there. I'm not sure what it is, but someone smarter than me can figure it out. Demi nodded in agreement. I like that. Marius breathed a sigh of relief. He hadn't yet worked up the courage to tell the others what he suspected, that Lucrezia was the Night Swan. He wasn't even sure how they'd react once they found out. Okay, so with a bit of luck, by the start of week 4, we've mostly built up the rapport we want with the other barons. We've seeded the appropriate level of doubt in Count Lotheed's competence. We continue to work to build up our own reputation in town, and I guess we play it by ear from there, summarized Demi. Sounds like a plan, affirmed Aurelius. There was a knock at the estate door. Rankle shifted his appearance to Willem and went to open the door. My lord, he called from the front door. It's the sheriff. She appears to have someone in custody. The companions came to the door. Sheriff Honora was roughly shoving a woman with dark hair and an angry grimace into the entry hall. Baron, said the sheriff, and as she gave the customary address, Aurelius could see that she had a black eye, something which she did not have when they had left the tavern very late last night. Now seems as good a time as any to introduce you to another one of your duties as Lord of Stakis, the judging of crimes. Aurelius furrowed his brow. He hadn't quite planned on this, but he quickly realized setting the tone for justice in his barony would be important in terms of how he was perceived. Explain my responsibilities here in more detail, he said simply. I won't need to do this for every altercation, explained Sheriff Honora, but hearing how you deal with our hamlet's criminal activities will help me know how to adjudicate future incidents. Plus, in this particular case, I'd be a compromised judge as I am myself involved. Okay, said Aurelius, let's hear it. Very well, said Honora. This young lady is Licinia Mag, a local drunk and troublemaker. Officially, I had banned her from my tavern for causing trouble in the past, but last night almost the entire town was over. I didn't notice her in the crowds. After you left, I'm afraid to say she fell back on old habits. As people began leaving, she started a brawl. When I went to break up the fight, she punched me in the face. She indicated the black eye. In my startle, she grabbed my purse of coins, containing about 22 silver pieces, and a bottle of old law whiskey I was carrying. Fortunately, she didn't get very far. I found her passed out drunk in Josini's bar after sunup. I recovered my purse, but she'd polished off the whiskey. There was probably about 10 gold pieces she finished there. Aurelius found he was trying his best not to show how little he cared about this small-town country hooliganism, and instead assessed the whole situation with a concerned brow. All right, let's hear if Licinia has anything to say in her defense, he said. Let's ungag her. Licinia had essentially nothing to say in her own defense, aside from sharing some choice opinions on the subject of the new baron's parentage. The companions held a private discussion. This was an open and shut case, but it wasn't so obvious what to do. There was no perfect solution here. Based on Honora's summary, Licinia had skirted a fine line of criminality, not violent enough for severe punishment, but not appearing willing to reform. By Count Lotheed's laws of the land, multiple counts of assault, and this was certainly not the first drunken incident Licinia had been involved in, was punishable by removal of a hand, but that seemed overly harsh to Aurelius. Finally, they reached a verdict. Licinia, said Aurelius, over the next 2 weeks we'll be repairing the pump house. This will bring clean water to the town of Stakis, and it will require a good deal of labor. Having just been there, I know it's a mess right now, and before repairs can be done in the pump house, it will need to be cleaned out. I'm going to assign you to 2 weeks of public service, starting with the cleaning out of the old pump house. In doing so, you'll avoid any more serious reprisals, and you'll do some good to the community to make up for your brash actions. If I hear that you're shirking your duties, you'll face some more significant consequences. Is that understood? Licinia seemed annoyed, but she was wise enough not to talk back in her present condition. She nodded her assent. Aurelius also whispered to Honora that he would privately compensate her for the loss of the liquor, and that Demi would see to her black eye. With all that said, Honora ultimately seemed pleased enough with her sentencing, though she did insist on assigning a deputy to watch over Licinia to make sure she wasn't slacking in her assigned responsibilities. After this, the group split up, taking care of various tasks around town. Rankle directed some of the laborers to repairs needed around the estate. Demi and Marius coordinated work on the common marketplace, while Diyanah helped set up the work at the pump house, and Aurelius joined him too, though his focus was on studying the old magical pump. They had all gotten so little sleep the night before, and they knew that they had an early ride out to Baron Okerra's estate the following day, that they all chose to call it an early night that evening, so that they might be well rested for the journey on the morrow. The road to the Okerra estate, Marat County, Taldor, second week of summer, 4718. For a trip they could make in a day, like the short ride to the Okerra estate, the companions decided they preferred to leave behind the carriage, as they would make better time just riding horses directly, and they had no great need for excessive supplies that couldn't be contained in their handy haversacks. As they rode down the short road to Pensaris, they found two peasants arguing. They didn't mean to rubberneck, but the discussion was getting so heated that they slowed their horses and witnessed some of the exchange. It was clear they were brothers, Tabo and Tumnus, and they were fighting over the purchase of a calf, and were very near to coming to blows. "How much is this calf worth?" asked Lord Diyanah Frascati, who had no idea what the value of such a thing might be. The brothers stopped for a moment, looking up at the lord on his horse. "It's worth 12 silver pieces, my lord, but my brother paid me only 8, cried Tabo indignantly, and he tugged hard on the calf's reins. "Ha ha!" laughed Diyanah. "Here, for your troubles!" Diyanah fished out a single platinum piece from his haversack and chucked it their way. Tabo released the calf immediately and scrambled for the piece. He had never seen a platinum piece before, but he knew immediately what it was. Worth 10 gold pieces, 10 times the value of the calf. "My lord," he cried after him, "I've no word of thanks." Behind him, Tumnus stood there, feeling dejected, holding his partially paid-for calf on a leash. "Tell your friends this was courtesy of the generous Aurelius of House Betinos, new Baron of Stakis," he declared, and he kicked his horse back into a ride. Aurelius wasn't quite sure that was the way to show generosity, but at least one of the two brothers seemed satisfied with the outcome. When they reached their destination, Baron Nicolaus Okerra came out to meet Aurelius and his companions at the gates of his estate. He was accompanied by his friend and squire, the Baronet Phi Paben. But to Marius' disappointment, Sally was not with them, as he did love the young girl's energy and delight in stories of adventure. He had quite hoped to tell her of the deadly ghouls they had faced at the pump house. When Marius inquired about this, Phi told him that she was playing in the gardens, and the Baron asked him to run out and fetch her, as she'd be excited to see again the champion that had unseated her father at the joust. Phi nodded and excused himself from the group to fetch her. Nicolaus led them to a finely appointed picnic that his servants had laid out for them on a table in the garden. Something to nibble on, he had suggested, since he knew Aurelius and his company would have worked up an appetite on the ride over. The subject matter turned quickly to the state of Stakis. Aurelius reported on all the good works they had done so far, and explained what investments they were planning to make in the town. Baron Okerra had a number of good suggestions of his own, which Rankle recorded eagerly in a logbook he had brought with him, as he had begun to play the part of both valet and accountant. At this point, Demi had an idea that she wished to present to Baron Okerra. "I really do believe that in time Baron Aurelius will turn the fortunes of Stakis around, and you'll have a thriving community located not far from Pensaris. For this reason I was thinking it might make sense to begin working with you on another canal. Look here, it's less than 1.5 miles between the Stakis River and the Pensaris River. If we connected these two by canal, we could get river travel between our two cities, vastly improving the rate at which we can exchange goods. I knew from the moment we chatted in the capital that your friendship would pay dividends. Say no more. This is a great idea, and I shall begin working on the logistics for such a channel at once." At this moment, Baronet Phi Paben came back looking a little disconcerted. "My lord, I have a bit of troubling news," he said to Baron Okerra. "I can't seem to find Sally. I've checked all over the grounds." Okerra stood up from the picnic table and looked troubled. "Phi, you always have to keep an eye on her. She has a great love of trouble, my Sally. Do you remember her saying anything that might suggest where she'd go?" "Now that you mention it," he said, thinking about it, "she had been talking about the legendary sea monster of Lake Pensaris." "Oh, you fool," said Baron Okerra. "If she's gone to the lake, she's going to go and try to catch the general. He's been sighted again by the villagers. Please, my friends, gather your horses. We need to ride in all haste to check on her." As they rode, Marius asked Phi Paben about this so-called legendary fish. Although it was a hectic ride, he was able to get the young man to share what he knew as they rode. He learned that Lake Pensaris was the largest lake in the county, at 12 miles long and almost 2 miles wide. It was also unusually deep for the area, almost 200 feet at the center. Bass, perch, and trout were all abundant, as well as numerous breeds of catfish. Steep stone walls made most of the lake's eastern shores inaccessible, but a small dock near the town of Pensaris, the same as they had passed on the way in, was used by small boats to jetty out onto the lake. Like any lake of reasonable size, Lake Pensaris was home to countless fish stories, though the most frequent were the tall tales of the General, a sizable catfish that locals claimed had eluded them for centuries. The occasional disappearance of local anglers were usually attributed to the General conscripting victims to serve in his lakebed army. It just so happened that there was more truth to these legends than mere stories. Baron Okerra himself had laid eyes on the great fish, and if Sally had gone out to the lake in search of it, then she might be in trouble. It was a lazy afternoon, and when they reached the pier, they found it to be empty, save for a lone, solitary dinghy floating out alone in the lake, carrying, of course, none other than Okerra, who had dropped one of the dinghy's oars in the lake and was using the other one to swat at what could only be described as a truly monstrous catfish, which was using its bulk to ram into the boat, trying to knock her off balance and get her to fall into the river. Baron Okerra wasted no time in stopping his horse and unhooking another one of the dinghies tied off at the pier. "Quickly, help me get this boat loose." But Diyanah didn't even wait to loosen a dinghy. The agile monk leapt off his horse, took a tumble along the pier, flipped back up onto his legs, and ran the length of it. Then he took a great leaping dive through the air, landing elegantly in the water and swimming after the fish. Okerra and the others paused to see Diyanah's shadow disappear towards the dinghy on the lake. As it did so, the giant catfish stopped breaching, and Sally stopped swatting at the water and took a minute to regain her balance. For a few seconds all was still on the lake's edge, and then from the depths a slick of crimson blood rose up to meet the water. Sally looked down in horror to see an ugly fish face rise up out of the bloody water, and she let out a blood-curdling shriek that could be heard all the way down the pier. But it was a false alarm, merely Diyanah coming up out of the drink and dragging the beaten body of the giant catfish over the lip of Sally's dinghy. "Tonight we serve up the general," he said to her. "Yippee!" she shouted back. Back on the docks, Baron Okerra rolled his eyes. "Please tell your friend not to encourage her," he said to Marius. That evening they did indeed feast on catfish, though. Sally gave a dramatic retelling of the general's defeat at the hands of the mighty Lord Frascati, and then asked Marius to give the others a totally true and unexaggerated accounting of how he had defeated the Faceless Queen. Despite Sally not appearing to have learned any kind of lesson from her ordeal, Baron Okerra soon found himself having fun and enjoying the company. In fact, saving Sally had made Baron Okerra fast friends with the party. Okerra agreed to pay for the entirety of the canal to connect their two realms, and he offered to put in some investment on the old Gold Canyon Bridge, as to his mind, although that was Bettany lands, that bridge was for the betterment of the whole county. Aurelius even managed to steer the discussion towards the subject of Count Lotheed's rule, and the normally well-disciplined Okerra shared that he had certainly been frustrated by Lotheed's lack of action, particularly as Stachys wasted away in the absence of the Bettany family support. A better count might have repaired the pump house and the bridge directly, regardless of whose lands they lay in. He watched his tongue after this, not wishing to seem an idle gossip, yet in these moments the truth was laid bare. When it came to it, they could likely count on Okerra's support. The Voinum Estate, Marat County, Taldor, second week of summer, 4718. The center of Baroness Voinum's domain was the city of Voinaris, derived from her family name, and it shared with noble House Voinum the tradition of military service, and many of the county soldiers were drawn from this otherwise sleepy town. The pungent scent of wine and vinegar, the town's two other main exports, tainted the air for miles in every direction. The Voinum estate stood 3 miles outside of town, and featured one of the most extensive wine cellars in Taldor, with vintage bottles dating back centuries, and secret rooms storing various recipes, wines, and strains of yeast from across Avestan and Casmarin. Diyanah soon understood why Voinum had been so excited by the re-establishment of the Stachys vineyards, as to call the Baroness a wine enthusiast was to grossly undersell her love of the grape. In coming to the Voinum estate, Baron Aurelius and his companions hoped to accomplish here what they had accomplished in Pensaris, securing both friendship and even hopefully some funding. It was a longer ride to Voinaris, though, and so they arrived fairly late in the day, but just in time for dinner. Baroness Voinum had laid out a long dining hall. She was unaccompanied, save for the clever handmaiden that Rankle had spoken with at length at the Palace of Birdsong Jubilee. Having Diyanah with them was actually a godsend for the party in Voinum's estate, because his knowledge of wine was a near match to hers, and very soon it became just the two of them engaged deeply in a conversation about barrel aging and tannins and fruit forwardness and mouthfeel that frankly nobody else could follow, though Demi made a passable effort. Aurelius, Marius, and Rankle instead spoke mainly with her handmaiden, and hoped that in doing so the recounting of some of their good deeds in Stachys would filter back to Baroness Voinum in time. They told her of how they had cleared the pump house of the ghouls, and she told them in turn that she had realized they were a formidable force from the moment they had returned with the head of the Iron Lash, the terrible manticore that had terrorized the farmlands of Marat. That night Voinum offered them fine rooms in her estate to spend the night at, but as they reconvened before they slept that night, they all agreed they hadn't made the same successful headway here that they had with Okerra. Certainly Voinum was eager for them to reopen the Stachys vineyards, and she enjoyed discussing wine with Diyanah, but her politics remained a completely closed book. If they did eventually suggest a vote of no confidence against Count Lotheed in order to oust him, they had no idea how Voinum would receive that. Baroness Voinum offered them a fine breakfast the next morning, fresh fruit over an oat and barley porridge, with sliced lamb and pork sausage on the side. As they tucked in, the Baroness addressed the group, and she took a slightly different tone than she had last night. "My friends," she said. Already an odd start, as she favoured titles, and generally preferred to direct her conversations to Aurelius and Diyanah, or had at least last night. "Last night, after you went to bed, I had an extensive discussion with my handmaid. She relayed to me the story of how you personally slew a den of ghouls in the old Stakis pump house." "Yes, yes," said Diyanah, waving a pork sausage triumphantly at the end of his fork, "and a mighty battle it was. And of course I witnessed you bring back the corpse of the Iron Lash of Marat at the Jubilee Hunt. There was no funny business there. I assume you really did encounter and slay the Manticore?" she asked. "Yes, no funny business," confirmed Aurelius. "We have no secret army. We're all just capable in our own ways. But we find that when we work together, there's little we can't overcome." "Well then," said Voinum, "I have a secret to share, and a request to make, but only if before hearing it you will swear yourself to secrecy. This is important, and I believe our friendship may lie at stake." Aurelius replied cautiously, "We would love to help you with any troubles you may have, but I'm leery of agreeing to secrecy without knowing the nature of the secret." Voinum seemed slightly disappointed, but Demi weighed in. "Baron Aurelius is cautious by nature, and knowing him well, I'm sure he wishes to discuss this with us and make sure we're all in accord before he agrees to anything. But I'm a little more brazen. I say there is no need. We would all agree to keep your secret. You may trust us." Aurelius and Demi shared an understanding glance, and Aurelius nodded back to Voinum. "Yes, Demi speaks true, I think." He looked at the others. "Unless one of our other companions objects, we can be trusted to both keep your secret and to help in whatever way we can." This seemed to satisfy her. "Here's my situation, then. My barony comprises not one but 2 towns. Obviously, you've seen Voinaris, the larger of the 2 settlements contained in my barony. The second is a little ways north of here. It's called Sotto, and it's something of a small logging town. The settlement is little more than a dozen homes and barns built around a common well. Residents there have traditionally been stubbornly independent, paying their taxes, but otherwise not having much to do with the rest of the barony." Aurelius nodded along, and Baroness Voinum continued. "Also it was until recently. For the last few months, Sotto has not been able to pay its taxes to me. I have not shared this with Count Lothide. Instead, I've been making up for the discrepancy from my own coffers, to pay the taxes owed from the barony up to the county." Marius, suddenly fascinated by getting an inner look at the workings of rural state governance, asked, "But why not report the shortfall in the town of Sotto rather than conceal it?" "Because the situation in Sotto is complicated, and because I don't trust Count Lothide not to use the events as an opportunity to discredit me and my management of the barony." "What's happening in Sotto?" asked Aurelius. "The community is quietly under siege," she said. "The community has always fought against wolves in the Verduran forest, and almost every family home there features a few wolf trophies, and they frequently export winter coats made of wolf pelt. But Sotto's tradition of wolf hunting has offended some of the Verduran forest's other, more dangerous inhabitants." "Werewolves," said Demi, who knew the Verduran well. "That's exactly right. A group of werewolf brigands have moved in. So far they seem content in extorting the town, knowing that converting the citizens to afflicted werewolves would likely draw too much attention. They have instead been siphoning monies out of the town. If I go to Count Lothide, he will likely have the means of eradicating them, or chasing them off. But that would be an admission of my own inability to deal with the problem." "But you do, in fact, lack the resources to deal with the wolves yourself," concluded Aurelius. "I have soldiers, I have house guards, and I have plenty of weapons. But as Demi likely knows, conventional weapons are almost completely ineffective against lycanthropes. Silver weapons are very expensive. I have been stockpiling silver sheen, a coating that can be used to turn a normal weapon lethal to a werewolf. But I fear that my house guards will fall to panic when the wolves transform into their more monstrous form. Moreover, I feel like I will only get one shot at this. If even one werewolf survives, they can cause untold damage to the community by biting farmers and allowing them to become uncontrolled, afflicted lycanthropes, those that are rarely able to control the transformation when the moon shifts." "And you think that since we killed the ghouls and the Manticore," said Diyanah, "you think we might have what it takes to square off against some werewolves?" "That's what I was hoping," she said. "Do this for me, and I'll provide further help to your financing of Stakis, beyond my promise to help with the vineyards. Keep your word, and don't breathe a word of this to Count Lothide, and you'll have a fast friend." "Thank you for sharing this," said Aurelius. "And You already have a fast friend at this point. In the short time I've been here, I already completely understand your concern about Count Lothide. He pays attention to everything, and he's not afraid to push an advantage. He paused. He wanted to be careful not to overstate things. If Voinum was friendlier with Lothide than she let on, that could be a problem in the future. But for now, everything was making sense. Do you have any idea where the werewolf brigands operate from? He asked. Somewhere in the woods north of Sotto, she said, but I haven't been able to exactly figure out where. Okay, leave it to us. We'll figure out a plan and see what we can do. The group discussed various options for approaching Sotto after that. It became very clear that approaching Sotto as the new Baron of Stakis and company would trigger alarm bells among the werewolves, so some kind of disguise was in order. Thankfully, all party members were possessed of a means of disguise. Aurelius was a mage of the veil. Rankle had the fey gift of many faces. Diyanah a hat of disguise. Demi wore the magical envoy ring, recuperated from Daggio the Magnificent, which also conferred magical disguises. Only Marius had no means of disguise, but with a quick change of clothes he was the most passable as a farmer anyway. Diyanah then remembered that when he and Voinum had done the tour of the wine cellar last night, he couldn't help but notice the vast number of turnips in the larder. It's true, said Voinum. I purchased a bulk a little while ago from some farmers that came in from Elmhost County just to the west. We don't grow turnips in Murat, and in a suitably dry, cool larder they keep well, so I bought out their entire inventory. May we have the turnips? Asked Aurelius. In order to better investigate the town, we wish to disguise ourselves as maybe simple traveling turnip farmers, and of course, if we could borrow as much silver sheen as you can spare. That seems like a small price to pay for the liberation of Sotto. Of course, said Baroness Voinum. This then became the plan. They also borrowed an old dilapidated cart and some mules, which seemed more appropriate than their fine riding horses. They disguised themselves as simple farmers, and they headed north to Sotto. They reached the village of Sotto in the mid-afternoon. It was, as Voinum had described, a modest village of timber buildings. Many of the buildings had a wolf pelt hanging from the doorframe of the home, and Aurelius idly wondered if there was any significance to that. It seemed like a fairly empty and quiet village for a sunny afternoon like this. Usually a village like this would be filled with the sounds of children playing at this hour, or the humming work tunes of labourers. They spotted a solitary villager pushing a wheelbarrow full of felled lumber through the town, and Rankle stopped the mules and the turnip-laden cart. "Greetings, good sir. We're a group of farmers from over Elmhost way. We came up by the canal looking to trade in our turnips," he called, doing a damn fine impression of a local farmhand, "which we hear are hard to come by here in Murat. Is there a market in town where we might be able to sell our wares?" The man was so spooked at being addressed. "Oh, good gracious! Sorry for my reaction. I was in a world of me own, and you gave me an awful fright just there." But seeing it was just a humble group of turnip sellers, he relaxed slightly. "Sorry to say, market's already closed for the day. You know, we don't get many visitors in Sotto these days. You might find better business in Voinum down to the south." Rankle made a visor with his hands over his forehead and made a show of inspecting the sky. "You might well be right there, but at this point we'd miss the light." The villager considered this and said, "Well, in that case you can always head down to the inn and tavern in town. That's that big building over yonder, you see, the one with the hanging sign. You could spend the night there and set up shop in the morning. Or you never know, check with Tavern Keep Grigori. He may just be willing to buy up your inventory. Looks like a good stockpile you've brought with you." "Aye, so it is," said Rankle, slapping the cart. "Finest turnips in Elmhost. Anyway, thank you kindly for your advice, good sirs." The tavern was spacious but in need of dusting. A small bell rang as they entered. A solitary tavern keep looked up from where he was wiping down his work area. Two men were having a hushed conversation in one corner of the tavern over a pair of meads, and in another corner 2 young village girls were whispering conspiratorially and grinning. Aurelius and Rankle approached the barkeep and gave him the whole story of how they were turnip sellers from Elmhost, looking to offload a bunch of turnips. As the villager outside had noted, the tavern keep was quite open to purchasing from them, and this led Rankle down the road of having to haggle with a man in order to keep their cover. Aurelius, meanwhile, was frustrated that despite coming up with various ways of asking the tavern keep what the news and gossip was in town, the tavern keep was remaining completely tight-lipped about any troubles they might be having. While this haggling was going on, Demi and Marius tried to strike up a conversation with the 2 men in the shadowy corner of the bar. But this went no better than Aurelius's effort to get information from the barkeep. The 2 men politely but firmly requested Demi and Marius mind their own business. Diyanah, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice the 2 local village girls in their late teens or early 20s that were looking at him. This surprised him, since he wasn't wearing his usual fancy duds, But then again it occurred to him that in a remote village like Sotto, a travelling farmhand from as far out as Elmhurst County might be something of a catch in these parts. This idea was immediately appealing to him, so he dropped a pouch of coins on the bar, perhaps a little too showy for a farmhand, but Diyanah could only ever be himself, and snagged a couple of bottles of wine and an extra mug from the tavern, and made his way over to the girls. He filled up their glasses, and made up some wild stories about having to chase off a pack of dire boars back home to secure these impressive turnips. He wasn't sure if the girls believed him, but they seemed to love the story. They were also happily and quickly drinking the wine he was pouring for them, and with each time he refilled their cup, they seemed more eager to share what was going on in town. "So tell me, ladies," he said with bravado, "what's the craziest things gals like you get up to in Sotto?" "You know," said one, "Sotto isn't the quiet town it seems to be." "Shh," said the other one. "We're not supposed to talk about that." "Now you have me really interested," said Diyanah. The first girl waved off the other, more cautious girl. "Yeah, we have some bad men in town, some dangerous men, but we're not scared of them." "No, you two look like the kind of girls that like a bit of danger in their lives," offered Diyanah with a suggestive raising of his eyebrows, and he was quick to refill their cups. "Oh, you have no idea," said the first. At this point the second was throwing caution to the wind as well and joining in, trying to impress him. "Yeah, they have a little hideout in the woods. Sometimes they take us back there with them, but we never get scared." "Is that right?" said Diyanah. "See that man across the bar talking to the other man? He's totally one of them, and you wouldn't want to mess with him." And she indicated, as discreetly as a woman in her state of inebriation could, the man with long dark hair sharing a shadowed booth in the corner with another older man. Across the bar, Rankle and Aurelius were finalizing their turnip transaction with the barkeep, as Demi and Marius were returning from their failed efforts to interject themselves in the other conversation. Then Diyanah approached them triumphantly. "My friends," he whispered, "that man across the bar, don't look now, with the long hair, is definitely a werewolf. They're probably going to gather up tonight, which means if we tail him, he'll lead us to their lair. It's a cave in the woods at the end of a switchback trail." "Wow, Diyanah, how did you figure all that out?" asked Marius. Diyanah winked at the two girls across the bar, who waved back at him enthusiastically. "I have my ways." "How obvious were you, Diyanah? Something is definitely going to go sideways, isn't it?" said Aurelius nervously. "Oh, ye of little faith. Also," he said, as he grabbed some bar nuts from the tavern bar and shoved them in his mouth, "I don't know if you've figured out the whole room bookings at the inn situation yet, but I'm definitely going to need my own room, like away from everyone else, just in case, we're still figuring that out." Then Rankle shook their shoulders. "Don't look now, but our wolf man is on the move. Aurelius, do you have that scroll of sending you picked up from Avernathus?" Aurelius fetched it from his pack and handed it over. "Okay, I'm going to tail him. When we're headed to the cavern, I will signal you all magically to join me on the outskirts of the forest. I'll lead from there." Rankle looked around to make sure no one was looking at him, and then he used his fey powers to vanish from sight. "Remember," said a voice from the empty air, "stealth is the name of the game here. Try to leave town without anyone noticing." Then the stealthy oracle was gone, following his quarry. Aurelius booked a room upstairs, selecting one with a window on the second story facing the woods, so they could easily featherfall out to make a discreet getaway, and before long they were waiting for the signal from Rankle. Soon enough Rankle's voice came to them, and he called them to the back of the tavern where it abutted close to the woods. Aurelius's featherfall exit worked, and the party then set about making their way quietly along the woodland trail. "Hey, that's not a full moon, is it?" said Aurelius, nervously looking up at the sky. Demi looked up. "No, I think it's just waxing gibbous. Not that it matters. Natural-born lycanthropes have full control over their change. Be ready." They followed the trail quietly until they were about 100 feet shy of the beginning of the switchback that climbed up a natural hill at the end of the trail. "We need to stop here and prepare. Werewolves have a naturally keen sense of smell. If we get any closer than this and we are downwind, they may notice us." Rankle pulled out Silversheen and applied it to his scimitar. Demi and Marius didn't need to do this, as the potent magic of their two relic weapons, Dignity's barb and Coriana's blade respectively, would be just as effective against the supernatural werewolf physiology as a silver blade would be. Likewise, Diyanah informed them that thanks to his unique monastic training, his fists would surpass whatever defenses the werewolves possessed. Aurelius, however, transformed Rodrigo from figurine form into giant raven form, and then painstakingly applied the silver sheen to the bird's talons and beak. "Is that strictly necessary?" asked Rankle. "Hey, every little bit of strength helps in a fight like this," explained Aurelius. The plan was simple. Aurelius would enlarge both Diyanah and Marius for shock and awe. Demi and Rankle would approach by stealth and surprise them from the underbrush. Aurelius would keep back for magical support, but his greatest surprise would be Rodrigo, striking from the air, enlarged to the scale of a giant eagle. As Demi approached, they could see 2 men were guarding the lower corner of the switchback. Further up the trail, some light fortifications were guarded by bow-wielding rangers, accompanied by pet wolves. The cave lay beyond them. Rankle slipped invisibly out of the underbrush, and before long he found himself only a hair's breadth away from the first 2 guards. With a precise strike of his silver-sheen scimitar, he pushed his blade right through the heart of one of the 2 guards. The guard tried to cry out, but the howl died on his lips, and for a brief terrible moment Rankle watched as the man half transformed in response to the injury, but he was dead before the transformation could complete. The other guard, witnessing this sudden murder, began transitioning immediately into a hybrid wolf form, but Demi stepped out, rapidly reloading round after round of her crossbow and pinning the werewolf to the back of the cliff face. Although the wolfman was gravely injured, he wasn't killed, and he quickly let out a warning howl. That was as far as they were getting with stealth still in play. So Demi started singing, the signal Diyanah and Marius needed to climb the switchback. They had no need to traverse back and forth along the trail. They had the strength and scale to leapfrog the trail lips, rapidly closing the gap to the fortified cave entrance. The rangers guarding the entrance knocked their bows and ordered their wolves to charge at the 2 assailants. Diyanah and Marius had dodged a few well-placed arrows from the werewolf guardians, but only a few, as moments later, Rodrigo, magically enlarged, came screaming out of the sky. It wasn't just one giant raven either. Aurelius had thought this through. He had further enhanced Rodrigo with a minor image illusion spell, which conjured the image that he was both radiating magical fire and that he was accompanied by a vast flock of additional smaller ravens. This had the desired effect, causing the rangers to turn their attention upwards and fire their longbows into the illusory swarms. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the switchback, Rankle was squaring off 1-on-1 against the werewolf that had sounded the alert. Skewered by bolts and unprepared for the finesse of Rankle's lightning-fast attacks, Demi realized that she could just leave him to it, and began making her own way up the switchback. As soon as she rounded the second turn, she could see the wolves bounding towards Marius and Diyanah. She had enough knowledge of nature to know that these were likely not werewolves in wolf form, but pet wolves, kept by the werewolves to secure their little fiefdom here. "Sleep," she whispered forcefully, as she placed her bardic magic on the wolves. The wolves took a spill as they raced down the switchback, landing in a heap and sleeping fitfully. Demi was pleased to note that no wolves would be harmed in the execution of this particular adventure. Marius and Diyanah were soon leaping onto the top level of the switchback trail, right before the cave mouth. Rodrigo was already there, pecking and clawing at one of the rangers. They rushed the second ranger, who stood little chance against their combined might. Somewhere down below, Aurelius had caught up with Rankle, who was still dispatching the second switchback guard. Aurelius whipped a bolt of acid at the guard, stealing the kill from Rankle just as he was about to put his blade through him. "Come on," said Aurelius. "We gotta climb or we'll miss the action." Both began jogging up the trail. Back at the top level, the second ranger was already on his last legs from his skirmish with Rodrigo when Marius and Diyanah turned their attention to him. He was taken out by a well-placed punch with Coriana's blade to the small of his back. Just as they dispatched him, another werewolf poked its head out the cave, and seeing the bloody mess left behind outside, he quickly ran back inside to fetch reinforcements. Diyanah and Marius took a moment, both conflicted about whether to give chase. As though Demi was nearing the curve of the last switchback, Aurelius and Rankle were still at the bottom of the hill, and it might make sense to wait and reconsolidate their power. Rodrigo, however, made their choice for them, flying down the cave tunnel and burying its talons in the back of the fleeing werewolf. It roared in pain, and up ahead in the darkness, the sounds of heavy paws came echoing through the tunnels. Diyanah and Marius didn't give it a second thought. They followed the giant raven into the tunnels. Up ahead, the passage split in two. In addition to the werewolf that Rodrigo had pounced on, just shy of the intersection, two lupine figures appeared in the left tunnel, and two more figures could be seen in the right. Marius and Diyanah split up, squaring off against a pair of werewolves, each coming down the tunnels. Diyanah's pair comprised of one warrior, who was slightly further ahead, and a slightly less ferocious-looking wolfman wearing a raiment of bones, a shaman of some kind, perhaps. In fact, no sooner did Diyanah take in his appearance, and an arc of lightning flew down the tunnel from the creature's outstretched fingers. Diyanah leapt neatly aside, fully avoiding the lightning arc with his honed monk reflexes, but further down the tunnel both Rodrigo and the werewolf he was clawing were engulfed in the lightning. This collateral damage appeared to kill the shaman's own ally, though if the shaman felt any guilt at this he showed no indication. Rodrigo was unfortunately also electrocuted, suddenly disappearing, leaving behind only the soft click as the black basalt figurine of the raven hit the cavern rocks. On Marius' side there was also a warrior, with whom Marius almost collided with now, and behind the warrior, a werewolf in long tattered robes. It stopped its charge and howled, a long, tuneful howl. The werewolves responded to this howl by striking faster and more aggressively. Both Marius and Diyanah feared that they might be overwhelmed by the ferocity of their respective warriors' attacks. "They've got some kind of bard," said Marius, who, thanks to having fought alongside Demi a few times now, knew the telltale signs of song magic. "Ignore the warrior," replied back Diyanah. "Try to get at the bard. That's a force multiplier." Demi had stepped into the tunnel at this point, her own tonal singing blasting down the tunnels and invigorating Marius and Diyanah. "You've got a bard too," said Demi, firing her deadly crossbow at the enemy bard. The werewolves had the same idea that Marius and Aurelius did. The two warriors ignored Marius and Diyanah, clawing their way around them to try and get at Demi. Diyanah took advantage of this reprieve to descend in force on the shaman on the left tunnel. But Marius was quick enough that as his warrior disengaged with him, he lashed out with a broad sweep, tripping the werewolf and knocking him to the floor before he could reach Demi. He considered attacking the howling lupine bard for a moment, but he thought the prone werewolf would be an easier target, and he leapt onto it and punched it again and again with his relic blade. Diyanah was getting the better of the shaman, but the werewolf bard was still singing, and the werewolf that had slipped past Diyanah was now attacking Demi like a black blizzard of claws and fangs. Demi did her best to avoid the onslaught, but a few well-placed talons tore at her chain shirt and ripped off chunks of her synthetic flesh. Then, finally, a scimitar appeared out of nowhere, slicing into the werewolf. Rankle had arrived, and suddenly appeared from an invisible blink as he was wont to do. The werewolf turned around in shock, but Rankle was fast, stabbing again and again with the scimitar. Demi resumed shooting at the bard. Aurelius was there too, an arrow of acid striking the werewolf bard squarely in the center mass. It howled its last. Diyanah slew the shaman, just as Rankle overcame his own foe. The group took a breather for a moment. It had been a little frantic, but the plan had worked, and they had wiped out the werewolf lair. The rest was cleanup. They searched the caverns and found them to be empty. They also made plans to check back in Sotto, and confirm that they had gotten all the werewolves before returning to Baroness Voinum in Voinaris. No werewolves waited for them in town. It was a clean victory, and the citizens of Sotto rejoiced when they learned of the true identities of the turnip salesmen. Back in Voinaris, the Baroness was similarly relieved to hear of their success. As they finally departed back for the village of Stachys, a great weight felt as though it had been lifted from their shoulders. They had built strong alliances with both Baron Okerra and Baroness Voinum. Only Crabby and Talus remained to be won over. Good progress so far. End of chapter. Hi there, I'm the Mythkeeper. Thank you so much for watching. You've just watched Season 2, Episode 5 of my Pathfinder 616 War for the Crown series, The Wolves of Sotto. So, this is the first episode in this series of a set of, I think, 4 episodes, which I can broadly describe as fun adventures in Marat County. So, in each of these episodes that I'm doing, the heroes go on kind of 2 short adventures around Marat County, generally drumming up support and kind of trying to undercut the influence of the Count in the county. So in this particular episode, we've gone to Pensaris and we've dealt with a big fish called the General, and we've also gone to the town of Sotto and we fought a bunch of werewolves. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail about those encounters and how I ran those encounters and what might have been a little bit different from in the book. So the first episode is the episode in Pensaris, where our heroes fight the General, which is a big catfish. In the book, it basically suggests that the heroes might want to catch the General, because if they do, they will be considered local legends. And that's kind of the entire impetus for them going to Lake Pensaris and going fishing for this legendary fish. I read that and I basically thought I need a more urgent tie to the mission, and so I had this idea that Selly would be kidnapped. The players at this point already had not kidnapped. She would be under attack by the fish, but they already had this relationship with Selly at this point that she would be a really good target for this kind of event. And I think it worked out well for my playgroup. The other mission is much more dramatically changed. So in the story as written, the Wolves of Sotto event, there's I think that the full scale of the encounter is 5 CR1 wolves and CR CR3 warg, right? So there are no werewolves. It's a warg, which is like a big intelligent wolf, and a pack of wolves that are attacking the town. I mentioned this with my ghoul encounter. If the players have a whole week to kind of to not prep, but to recover resources between encounters, you really need those encounters to be a little more challenging than presented in the book, at least for my players. By the time they did the Wolves of Sotto encounter, they were level 4 players. 3 CR1 wolves followed by 2 CR1 wolves and a CR3 warg would have been a fight not worth rolling for my playgroup. Fortunately, this adventure path seeds you with the ideas, and then you can alter it to a level of difficulty that makes sense for you and your playgroup. So in my particular case, I knew roughly what was happening in Sotto. It was quietly under siege. I wanted the level of enemies to be more difficult, so they became werewolves instead of a warg and some wolves. And then it was a case of like finding the right sort of terrain and map and making the counter sort of more interesting. The switchback trail I thought worked really well, and they did some fun stuff with that. Yeah, those are all the kinds of typical decisions that a GM has to make in those kinds of scenarios. You definitely want to make sure that every single encounter means something and is worth something. The other thing to consider is that if you are adding enemies, if you're adding bad guys, especially in my case, I added a powerful shaman and a powerful bard as well as enemies in the werewolf camp, that you probably are adding some commensurate magic items as well, which means that there's this is going to be a progressively more difficult challenge for you, because your players are going to get stronger and stronger, and you're going to have to keep throwing stronger and stronger enemies at them. The final thing that came out in this adventure is some more of the sub-mechanics were introduced. There were roadside encounters, which are these scripted encounters, which turned out to be a lot of fun. And also judging of crimes is another thing that gets introduced in this episode. We'll see more of those throughout. Those also were kind of fun ways of building up loyalty and just giving some fun RP encounters for our players and having them make some decisions that affected the town and the county. That's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed my little GM session here. Like, subscribe, do all the good things, and I'll see you next time.